Saka tinama elections edaya. Tati banda kuzobona kuti no voters say ngawabwira. Asi kune vamwe vakataura kuti vakatobudisa results avo.
Akabva kwatata mboenda kukwekwe. Taenda mbedroom mamukoma wangu ndobva ndanoona haiwa yelo kupera mbedroom mashitsi emukoma yelo nekiti dzemukoma yelo.
Kamtura kashataka.
The law and the manner in the framework in which the elections in Zimbabwe will be held is subject to international scrutiny. Now, many observer missions will be coming to Zimbabwe. The AU, SADC, and the European Union will also be deploying observer missions to Zimbabwe to come and look at how the process is going to be run. And they are going to be looking at a number of issues which include the legal frameworks, the environment in which the voting is going to be conducted in the actual voting. Now on this, the Free Talk, in partnership with the Frederick Newman Foundation for Freedom, we are going to be discussing and talking to these election observer missions. We will ask the questions that matter, and we will be able to bring to you the issues that should concern you and give you an understanding and a feel of how this election is happening. I'm your host as usual, Dara B. And I will bring you this, the Free Talk, in proud partnership with the Frederick Newman Foundation to answer your questions on this election. Join me just after this break. Welcome back to this, the Free Talk, in proud partnership with the Frederick Newman Foundation. And my name, as usual, your host, Dara B. This edition of the Free Talk, we are in conversation with the EU, the European Union Observer Mission. We are talking to them on what they are here to do. The EU produced a report in 2018 on the election. Is this report going to influence their report again? What elements of the past election are they looking at? Who are they going to talk to? And what are they going to be looking at? On this, the Free Talk, with me, your host, Dara Blessed Mhlanga. Now, I will welcome my guest. So Zimbabwe heads for an election on August 23, and the EU observer mission has already deployed observers in Zimbabwe. And I'm joined here by the Deputy Chief Observer for the EU mission. And I've been having trouble pronouncing the name. So you've got to invite me to Poland so that I practice pronouncing the name. But
Exactly.
Madam, thank you and welcome for joining me.
Thank you.
So that we can discuss your mission in Zimbabwe. But just first of all, I'll allow you to introduce yourself and just tell us how you find Zimbabwe.
Thank you very much, Makazimbaire. So my name is Beata Martin Rozumiłowicz. I'm the Deputy Chief Observer for this mission. I come from Poland, and I represent, I think, an extensive election observation effort, which in the end will involve all 27 member states, plus our partners from Canada, Switzerland, and Norway. So it's really a full-bodied expression of EU interest in these elections.
Amazing. Now, I just want us to have a bit of some background. In 2018, you came in also as the election observer mission. Now, I do understand these are different missions, but at that time, you put some recommendations as the EU. Now, how are these recommendations going to tie into this observer mission that you are?
Yeah, I would start by saying that the principle of election observation methodology is really built on looking at each election individually against the international principles, against the international standards, against the obligations that Zimbabwe has willingly taken upon itself, and the extent to which it matches national legislation. And so, although we're aware of the 2018 report and its findings, although the recommendations still remain extant, the 2023 election observation mission will really be looking at the process vis-a-vis those standards and the extent to which they match those standards, and it will be making its statement post-election in its preliminary statement of findings approximately 2 days after Election Day.
Yeah. So your reports in the past, in all the elections that you've observed in Zimbabwe, have been criticized by the government. It has been criticized as being anti-regime, but you continue to come. Why?
So the EU, as well as other organizations in this space, really come with a spirit of partnership. So we're not here just to criticize for criticism's sake, but really as an international community trying to build the kind of democratic societies together that the citizens of these countries have voiced that they want, and that the governments of these countries have signed up to international treaties to make that happen. So we're really here as part of an effort to learn from each other, to hold each other to account, and also to be able to offer assistance on how to achieve those common goals, the goals that the Zimbabwe people have set themselves, and the goals that the government has reflected in those kinds of obligations.
Yeah, but the aspect that your reports have never been accepted as impartial, but you continue to do that. Why?
Yeah, so I think our methodology is based on the principle of independence. It's based on the principle of impartiality. It's based on the principle of non-interference. And so in every mission that we deploy to whichever country we're observing in, we really, in all aspects of that mission, abide by these principles. And we really do the job that we're set to do based on first-hand information, based on evidence that we are able to verify ourselves as an election mission, and based on the extensive findings, which in this case will be up to 150 people by election all told. And so it's really a robust presence, and I think that first-hand evidence, that first-hand observation really does underscore the impartiality and the independence of our observation.
There's been always concern that observers come in a bit too late. And then they come in and then they write a report. And then they've missed a large chunk of the things that are happening before. Now, how do you feel about that concern?
So So I think from the EU's perspective, we really build these observations on long-term observation. And so as you see, we have already been here for some time. We're in the process of deploying long-term observers throughout the country. There will be 46 long-term observers in all 10 of the provinces throughout Zimbabwe. We'll also have a robust presence on election day, another 44 short-term observers plus locally recruited observers, as well as a European Parliament delegation of 7 parliamentarians. And so I think as the longest term observation internationally in the country, we really do look at the elections from a long-term perspective, at all aspects of that process, from the legal framework through to things like boundary delimitation, voter registration, which is essential, the way that candidates are registered, of course the election campaign, but we'll also be having an extensive media monitoring of the traditional broadcast and print media, and also an innovative social media monitoring component. And so all of these aspects together will really look at that long-term aspect of elections before, during, and after. And so although we recognize that election day is important, we also are very much aware that the long-term narrative is often the aspect that sets the tone and sets the context for how those elections take place.
So also there's been a concern that observers, when they come, they stay in the comfort of hotels and they're away from what is really happening. So is that really true?
I would say that is not true. And in fact, we, as I mentioned, are deploying throughout the country. Those observers will be present in 10 different locations, actually in 13 different locations, since we'll have duplication of some teams in some of the provinces. But beyond those urban areas, they will also be extensively traveling to rural areas, to villages, to meet with local interlocutors, and to really understand from the village all the way up how these elections are taking place. From the core team in Harare, we also plan to travel to visit those long-term observers, but also to hold meetings outside of the capital and to gain a context of how that is going to take place. And then, of course, on election day, those 150 people will be distributed all throughout the country in urban areas, but also in rural areas, and really have a balanced perspective in terms of how these elections are taking place.
Madam, why does the EU have an interest in Zimbabwean elections?
The EU, as a community of democracies, as a group of like-minded countries, is very interested to see these democratic principles also taking root and developing in other countries. And in Zimbabwe, which itself has stated its desire to mirror those kinds of democratic principles, as I mentioned, we're here in a kind of spirit of partnership to be able to look together to see whether those principles are being met, and whether we can work together to build a more democratic society throughout the world in a way which assists countries to cooperate with one another and reduces conflict in the long term.
Yeah, but you've been accused as EU of, or as the Western world, of being the ones that bring conflict to African countries. Doesn't that contradict what you're saying?
I think, if you look at the theoretical evidence, it's clear that democracies very unfrequently engage in conflict with each other. And so that basis of a democratic rule is really the basis for anti-conflictual relations. And I would say if you look at the continent of Europe and the way that democracy has developed, expanding to Eastern countries such as mine in Poland, it really has increased cooperation, it's increased understanding, and it's really reduced the possibilities for conflict, which we hope will also have an equal role in other parts of the world.
So you've been here for a few days. Have you in these few days met any of the political actors?
Yes, so we're in the process of holding those meetings. We had our initial meeting with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to announce our presence and to launch the observation mission as such. But we currently are in the process of meeting different political interlocutors, different legal interlocutors, different civil society interlocutors, and we have a series of different analysts who look at all aspects of that process in their own area of expertise. And so that is really ongoing at the moment.
And have these political interlocutors and civil society raised any red flags that the observer mission is looking into?
It's really a cohesive picture, so we're still in that process of understanding better how these elections are taking place. We take all of that information in and analyze it from the perspective of international principles. We also look to verify that information firsthand through our long-term observers. And so that is a long-term process. As I mentioned, the findings that we will make on that will be found in the statement of preliminary findings some 2 days after the elections. And so I think that job is ongoing, but rest assured that it really is a robust look into the entire process, and we hope to be able to make robust statements after the election about how that has taken place.
But if someone was to push back and say that most of your reports are predetermined and influenced by political actors of who might have a special place in the hearts of EU, what would you say?
I would push back against that very strongly, and I would say the independence of this mission is really at the core. All of the individuals who are hired are independent consultants who are experts in their field. They come with no predetermined notion and no predetermined agenda, and they really look to evaluate this process on the basis of their experience, on the basis of their knowledge, on the basis of the extent to which the process mirrors those international standards. And that's done really individually on a case-by-case basis with no comparison between different countries, no comparison between different time periods. So really to provide a snapshot of how this election meets those principles in 2023.
Yeah. But how do you talk about this independence when you're coming from a European Union that just a few days ago released a statement condemning the coming into law of the Patriotic Act in Zimbabwe, saying it stifles democracy and civil participation? You already have a position, don't you?
I think, the international community has been observing at a long time the developments in Zimbabwe. They have given importance to this election by the deployment of this election observation mission. That election observation mission really seeks to look at all aspects of the process, where the legislative framework is one element, and it's a very important element, but equally important will be to see how that legislative instrument is put into practice during the course of the elections. And so we will really be looking at how that plays out in the coming weeks and months, and that's something that we will also report upon in our preliminary statement and later in our final report.
Is there any opportunity during this mission that you could sit down with political interlocutors and discuss with them your concerns so that they might be corrected before election day?
I think this really comes to the heart of the difference between observation and monitoring. And so international election observation, as I mentioned, is really based on this principle of non-interference. So it's meant to hold up a mirror to society so that it can see reflected the various aspects which may be of question or of concern. And this is distinct from monitoring aspects, so there will also be citizen monitors in the country who may involve themselves in the process, who make recommendations during the process. As citizens of the country, that is their right and maybe their duty. As international observers, we really stand back from that process. We seek not to get involved and not to become part of that process during its development, but really at the end to be able to appropriately reflect and show the extent to which they come into terms with the international principles.
But who does that help now? Because the process would have happened, if there were irregularities, they would have happened, and the result, if there were irregularities, would then not really reflect the will of the people. So who does it help?
I think it helps the citizens of the country to reflect their concerns, to reflect the things that they would like to see improved in their society. It gives voice to those concerns in a wider perspective and perhaps at a higher political level. And it really brings international attention to the importance of these elections in Zimbabwe, to the importance of the developments that are going on in this country, without the illusion that these are anything but the purview of citizens of the country. It's really up to Zimbabwean citizens to determine the legitimacy of these elections, and it's up to them to be able to change their society in the way that they would see fit.
So the Zimbabwean government invited you to come and observe these elections. Do you owe any allegiance to those who have invited you?
No, I would say we're truly independent. The invitation comes from the government because that is the state institution which has taken those responsibilities onto itself. But other than the invitation, the association agreement that we have signed allows us access to all areas, allows us free movement throughout the country, allows us independence to ask the questions that we want to ask of the interlocutors that we think are important. And so hopefully that will lead to a very impartial and independent process that will properly reflect how the elections take place.
So you here on you talk about the legal framework as part of the way the EU will observe and assess the election. And the legal framework brings in the Patriotic Act that was signed into law, which says that Zimbabweans who speak to foreign government officials in a negative way have committed a crime. How then do you hope to be able to do your work effectively? You're part of a foreign government, and someone might feel criticizing or telling you the wrong things that are happening in the electoral process might get them arrested.
No, we understand these concerns, and we are always carrying out a duty of care in all of the meetings and all of the interactions that we conduct. And so we would not want to put anyone at risk in terms of their relationship in this observation, but it's built on an open and transparent methodology which is available and understandable to all. And the assessment of the legal framework will take in all of the components which comprise these elections, and as I mentioned, perhaps more importantly, how that legislative framework is applied in the coming weeks and months, and that really remains to be seen. It will be one of the elements that we will be looking at in these elections as part of that comprehensive picture that we hope to provide.
Do you, your observation, is it strictly from the day you arrived, or you could circle back and find out the things that happened before you arrived?
So our observation is based on first-hand evidence-based information which we gather while we're here. Of course, the context is something which is knowable, and we take that into account in terms of better understanding the situation in the country. But all aspects of the process that we will report upon, we hope to be able to see with our own eyes and to be able to hear with our own ears, to be able to substantiate and verify that information, and then be able to provide that accurately in the picture that we provide at the end of the election process.
And what role does your embassy in Harare play?
So there actually is no Polish embassy in Harare, and so they play a very little role because they're not present. In terms of other...
I meant the European Union embassy.
The European Union, yes. So
yes.
The European Union embassy, the delegation is independent and distinct from our election mission, and so we are aware of their presence, we are aware of the work that they do, but it's really a strictly separated exercise where we're invited as an independent institution which is not dependent on the EU delegation for its work, and in that sense really retains its institutional difference.
So the ambassador can't whisper anything in your ears like, this is what's happening?
I would say not, no. I think we really do work independently, and we take information in from all sources and evaluate it in terms of those professional standards which I mentioned.
I find intriguing that you'll be looking at the social media sphere. Now let us talk about that.
Yes.
Yes. Why do you have an interest in in that sphere? It's uncontrolled, people can say whatever they want.
So in the international perspective, it's clear that social media plays an increasing role in the political discourse. In Zimbabwe itself, recent academic research shows that it's the second most popular medium after radio, and so it really does have an important role to play in the election process. It's not to determine the kind of equity and equality that we would be looking for in traditional media, where broadcast media may have certain obligations that it has to espouse, but we do look at it to understand better how the political campaign is developing, to look at issues of disinformation and misinformation, divisive or incendiary speech, or aspects of hate speech, which hopefully will not come to play, but something which is of concern and something which can give rise to violence if not handled properly. So really to be able to evaluate that both from a qualitative but also from a quantitative aspect, and to be able to better understand how that plays into the overall context of these elections.
And you also are going to be looking at the conduct of the media. Now, can you just explain to me what media are you talking about?
Yeah, so traditionally, broadcast media, both radio and television, have certain obligations of equity, at least, and in certain campaign environments, of equality of treatment of candidates and positions. And so the election observation methodology also has a media monitoring methodology, which allows us to capture minute by minute and day by day how those different outlets are treating different contestants, and to see whether they respect those obligations of equity or equality as we move through the process. In terms of print media, of course, there's less obligation because it is a much more widespread media, but also to get a sense of whether there is pluralism, whether the electorate can get different points of view, and ultimately whether they can make an informed choice on election day from a variety of different news sources to be able to make free choice in terms of the candidates that they choose.
You also have a special aspect that you're looking at, the participation of women and the role of marginalized groups. Let's talk about that.
Indeed. So in every election, there are different components of society who have difficulty sometimes in accessing the process, or have traditional barriers which they need to overcome in order to be able to vote on equal terms. And that equality principle is something which is really enshrined in international documents like the UDHR or the ICCPR. Women are one particular group which have been disadvantaged across the globe. And so really looking at how they're able to participate in the process, both as voters but also as candidates, and whether their terms of participation are on equal terms with other candidates or voters that may be taking part. The same is true for persons with disability. The same is true for minority groups which may exist in a country. And so we're really looking at that principle of universality, that ultimately in any country you want as many citizens as possible to vote on equal terms with each other, and to see what measures are in place to allow that to happen.
Amazing. But are you aware that in Zimbabwe, women form the majority of voters?
Yes. And in many cases that's the case, but in the majority of population, that very often does not translate into the majority of political participation. And so looking at why, when there is a relative equity split within society, why that may not translate into political terms. And that's a question that we set ourselves in this observation.
Amazing. And you also are looking at the complaints and appeals process.
Indeed.
Why is this important?
Indeed. So the rule of law is essential to any kind of democratic process. It channels grievances through legitimate institutions, so that rather than taking those grievances to the street, there is an institution which hopefully can resolve those kinds of conflicts in a rule of law concept. And so seeing how the courts and other bodies are able to process those grievances, whether whether there are principles of justice which are respected, whether there are principles of rule of law which are respected, and to see whether those kinds of problems in the election process can be handled legitimately through different branches of government in an election process is crucial.
One would want to know how clear your eyes are, given the fact that the European Union and the British have constantly criticized the use of law to suppress dissenting voices. And these appeals processes come to that level. And you already have, as a bloc, criticized the abuse of the justice system by those in power. So how clear are your eyes when you look at this process, the complaints and appeals process?
I think our eyes are very clear. We have a very good understanding of legal process. We have international legal experts on our team. They have seen this type of legal process in very many countries in the world and really understand how to apply those principles of rule of law to the various complaints and appeals that will be taking place. As I mentioned, we don't come with a predetermined notion. We will be attending court cases, we will be listening to hearings, we will be meeting with lawyers, we will be speaking with justices, and to grasp how that process develops in these elections, I think is going to be especially crucial to this electoral process.
Yeah. Let us talk about the results. You're going to look at the conduct of polling and counting of votes. Last time the observer mission that was here had something to say about the transmission of results. I'm sure you've read that report. Now, are you specifically looking at anything in terms of transmission of results?
So again, we have a observation methodology which is based also on election day observation, which starts with the opening of polling stations, whether all of the procedures for opening take place in the correct manner, whether polling stations open on time, whether they're accessible to voters. And then throughout the day, we have a statistically relevant sample that we deploy throughout the polling stations to look at the voting and then to look at the counting in the evening, as well as the transmission of those results. The important thing is whether the procedures which are in place are able to protect and guarantee that the result is legitimate, and then following those procedures to make sure that they're implemented throughout the day is something that we will be putting particular attention on, not just during the voting, but as I say, all the way from the opening of polling stations, all the way through the closing of polling stations, the transmission of results, and then ultimately their tabulation into preliminary results and ultimately final results.
I understand you're not leaving on the day the results are announced.
That's correct. We will be here throughout the process. We intend to stay post-election day to also observe any complaints and appeals, any legal procedures that may take place after the declaration of preliminary results. And ultimately, we will be issuing a final report some 2 months after the election process, which will look not only up to election day and past it, but also making those kinds of recommendations to be able to improve the process for the future.
The European Union has also funded the running of elections in Zimbabwe. Are you following your money?
So what I can say, as I mentioned previously, is that we're independent institutions, and while we're aware that the European delegation has provided financing of certain aspects in its assistance programs, it's not something that we are directly involved in, and so these are questions which I would pose to the EU delegation.
But how do you say that your chief observer is a member of the European Parliament?
Correct.
From Italy.
Correct.
And he is obviously going to be concerned about how taxpayers' money are being used, wouldn't he?
I think that's a distinct role, and his mandate for this election observation is really to be looking at the process of the elections and the way that they're implemented. He'll be coming with a 7-person team around election day, which represents all of the different political families within the European Parliament. And it's really, as I mentioned before, to give voice and to give prominence to these elections and to the election observation so that others around the world are aware of what is taking place.
there's also been criticism that the West wants to impose its democracy on Africa. Why are you doing that?
So I would say that democracy is not a Western principle, it's a global principle. It's something that under various UN charters and various UN treaties has been espoused globally. I think it really has a fundamental resonance in people's lives across the world. And I would say democracy is not a Western principle, it's a global principle. It allows people to interact and to live in a certain type of society where they have voice, where they have the ability of choice, and where hopefully conflict is reduced. And that's something as the European Union that we commit ourselves to, but it's something also Zimbabwe has committed itself to, and we hope that together we can find that common cause.
Just out of interest, how is your experience in observing elections? What wealth of experience do you hold?
So I would say I have a very good experience in observation. My previous expertise was in the former Soviet Union, and so I was once head of the OSCE ODIHR election department. We observed elections in all 57 of our participating states, and so I've seen, I would say, over 200 elections globally, primarily in Europe, but increasingly in Africa. I was also the deputy chief observer in the Gambia in 2021, in Kenya in 2022. And so I think that comparative knowledge and that comparative expertise is something that I bring to bear for these elections in Zimbabwe.
I want to thank you very much, Madam, for joining us.
Thank you.
And we are in partnership as we go into these elections with the Frederick Newman Foundation for Freedom. And we will continue to be following your path in this observation, and we'll continue to knock at your doors to speak to you.
Wonderful.
And hear what your report will be, and we'll continue to cover you. But thank you so much for joining us. But maybe if there's anything that you would want to share with the people of Zimbabwe and with the world at large about your work here that you think is important for people to know, I'll give you this opportunity to say.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me for this interview. It's really been a pleasure to discuss these very important aspects with you. And I would just like to say to the people of Zimbabwe that we very much appreciate the opportunity to be in this wonderful country, to be able to work together to achieve common goals, and really to look to visions of the future where we can, as a community of democracies, work better together and achieve those common goals which all of us want. Thank you very much.
This is the Free Talk in proud partnership with the Frederick Newman Foundation for Freedom. We were talking about election observer missions, and I was in studio with the Deputy Chief Observer from the European Union. And I think you've heard yourselves. The mission says it is independent. It will conduct its work diligently, without influence, even from the EU delegation in Harare. Their findings are going to be based on first-hand experience. They are going to go there. They are going to see for themselves, and they are going to report. They're going to issue a preliminary report just 2 days after the elections, and a final report 2 months after the elections. Now, this is the Free Talk. We bring you the conversations that matter. We answer the questions for you. We ask the questions for you on this, the Free Talk, in proud partnership with the Frederick Newman Foundation. And I, your host as usual, Dara B. Until next time, thank you for joining us, and have a lovely evening. Thank you very much, and wish you the best of luck in your mission, ma'am.
Thank you very much.